I want to start by saying that I am not a naturally suspicious person. I don't watch true crime documentaries looking for inconsistencies and alibis. I don't assume the worst about strangers. And before any of this happened, I would have told you that I was, if anything, too trusting for my own good. I'm telling you this upfront because I need you to understand that what follows wasn't paranoia. It was a year of small, accumulating facts that eventually became impossible to ignore. And by the time I understood what I was looking at, I genuinely didn't know if telling anyone would put me in danger. I live in a quiet residential neighborhood outside Asheville, North Carolina, the kind of place with mature oak trees and a homeowners association that cares deeply about mailbox uniformity. I'd lived in my house for 6 years when the place next door, which had been empty for nearly 8 months after the previous owners divorced and sold, finally got a new occupant. Her name, she told me, was Emily Hargrove. I remembered the day she moved in with unusual clarity, which, in hindsight, I think was because something about her was slightly off from the very first conversation, though at the time I couldn't have told you what. She was maybe 32, 33, pretty in an understated way, with the kind of careful, watchful politeness that I initially read as shyness. She told me she'd moved from Ohio for a job in healthcare administration, that she didn't have family nearby, that she was looking forward to a quiet, simple life. All completely plausible things to say. Nothing about the content of what she told me raised any flags. It was something in the delivery, a kind of rehearsed quality to her small talk, like she'd practiced the answers to obvious questions before anyone had actually asked them. I want to be clear that for the first several months, I liked her. We fell into an easy, low-effort neighborly friendship, the kind built on borrowed garden tools and shared complaints about the HOA's newsletter. She brought me a plant when my father passed away that spring, a small, thoughtful gesture that meant more to me than she probably realized. I had no reason at all during those early months to think she was anything other than exactly who she said she was. The first crack came almost by accident, on a night in early autumn when she'd had 2 glasses of wine at a small gathering I'd hosted for a few neighbors. She was talking to another guest about growing up, some story about a childhood dog, and she said offhand, "We used to take him down to the lake every summer, back when we lived outside Harrisburg." Harrisburg is in Pennsylvania. She'd told me on multiple occasions that she grew up outside Columbus, Ohio. I noted it, but I didn't dwell on it because people misspeak, especially after wine, and geography is an easy thing to garble in casual conversation. I filed it away without really deciding to file it away, the way your brain sometimes holds on to a detail before you consciously understand why it mattered. The second crack came about 6 weeks later, and this one I couldn't as easily explain away. I was in my kitchen with the window cracked, and Emily was in her backyard on the phone, her voice raised slightly in the particular way people's voices rise when they think they're alone. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, I want to be clear about that. It was simply an open window on a quiet night. But I heard her say clearly in a tone I'd never heard her from before, sharper, more clipped, almost frightened. "I told you not to call this number. If he finds this number, everything falls apart. I need at least another year before anyone can trace anything back." I stood very still in my kitchen for a long moment after that. Everything falls apart. Anyone can trace anything back. These are not things a healthcare administrator with a quiet, simple life typically says on the phone in her backyard. I told myself initially that I might be misinterpreting an ordinary conversation, that maybe she was talking about a difficult ex-boyfriend, a stalking situation she was the victim of rather than the architect of, something that would explain the fear in her voice without implicating her in anything. I wanted genuinely to believe the most charitable version of events, because I liked her and because the alternative was uncomfortable to sit with. But then came the mail. About 2 months after the phone call, I was walking past her house during the day and noticed her mailbox door hanging slightly open, a few pieces of mail visible inside, clearly delivered but not yet collected. I want to be honest that what I did next wasn't fully innocent curiosity, not by that point. I looked. I didn't touch anything, I didn't take anything, but I looked, and what I saw was 2 pieces of mail addressed to 2 different names. One said Emily Hargrove, the other said Melissa Cantrell. I went home and I did something I'm not proud of, though I've made a kind of peace with it since, given everything that came. I searched the name Melissa Cantrell online, along with the town she'd once mentioned as her actual hometown, the one that didn't match Ohio or Pennsylvania either, a small town in West Virginia she'd let slip once in an unrelated conversation. What I found made my stomach drop in a way I still remember physically, a cold, sliding sensation, like the floor tilting slightly beneath me. Melissa Cantrell had been reported missing from that West Virginia town 14 years earlier at the age of 19. The case had gone cold within about a year. There were a handful of local news articles, grainy and dated, with a photograph of a teenage girl who, allowing for the passage of 14 years and some clear changes to hair color and style, bore an unmistakable resemblance to my next-door neighbor. I sat with that information for nearly 3 days before doing anything, because I genuinely did not know what I was looking at. There were, as I turned it over and over, several possible explanations, and not all of them were sinister. It was possible that Melissa Cantrell had run away from a difficult home, an abusive family, a controlling family, and had built an entirely new identity for necessity rather than malice, and that the fear in her voice on that phone call had been about protecting herself from whatever she'd originally fled, not about hiding a crime she'd committed. If that was the truth, then my digging felt a genuine betrayal of someone who had simply been trying to survive.
But there was another possibility, one that the cold case articles gently gestured toward without stating outright. 2 of the articles mentioned, briefly, that investigators had at one point looked into whether Melissa's disappearance was connected to the disappearance, several months prior, of a large sum of money from her then-boyfriend's family business, a used car dealership that had, according to one article, experienced significant unexplained losses around the same period. The connection had never been proven. The case had gone cold with more questions than answers. I didn't know which version of the truth I was living next door to, and that uncertainty, more than anything else, is what kept me from acting for as long as I did. I want to describe what the following months were like because they were genuinely strange, living in this state of low-grade, constant vigilance beside someone I still, in most ordinary daily interactions, liked. We continued our garden tool exchanges, we continued our small talk about the HOA, but I was watching her now, differently, cataloging every detail against what I'd found, and I think somewhere in that period she started sensing that something had shifted in me, though I tried very hard not to let it show. The thing that finally forced my hand happened on a Tuesday evening in early spring. A man I'd never seen before parked on our street and knocked on Emily's door. I watched from my window, not proud of it, but unable to stop myself. He wasn't threatening in his body language exactly, but there was something tense in the exchange, visible even through 2 panes of glass and a reasonable distance. Emily stepped outside to talk to him rather than letting him in, which struck me as significant, a boundary she was maintaining deliberately. The conversation lasted maybe 10 minutes. At one point, the man's voice rose enough that I could make out fragments through my cracked window. Something about 5 years is long enough, and you can't keep running this. After he left, Emily stood on her porch alone for a long time before going back inside. That night, I made the decision that I still, honestly, am not entirely sure was the right one, though I've come to believe it was, on balance, better than the alternative. I called a former colleague of mine, a woman named Renata, who worked at the time as a private investigator, someone I'd used years earlier for a completely unrelated legal matter involving my divorce. I told her everything I'd pieced together and asked her carefully to look into the situation, not to expose anyone, but simply to help me understand what I was actually dealing with, because I needed to know if I was living next door to a victim in hiding or something considerably more dangerous. Renata came back to me 3 weeks later with a story more complicated than either of the possibilities I'd imagined. Melissa Cantrell, it turned out, had not been abducted, and she had not been running from an abusive home, at least in no documented sense. She had, according to what Renata was able to piece together through court records, old employment history, and a handful of contacts in West Virginia, left voluntarily at 19 after discovering that her boyfriend's family, who ran the car dealership, was involved in a fairly significant fraud scheme involving falsified vehicle titles and insurance claims. Melissa had known enough about the operation, apparently, to be genuinely afraid of what would happen to her if she stayed, either from the family themselves or from whatever legal exposure she might have inherited by association. She had left with a modest amount of money that Renata's sources described carefully as disputed in its origin, took on a new identity through channels Renata declined to detail to me, and had been essentially reinventing herself every few years since, moving whenever the risk of discovery felt too high. The man on the porch, it turned out, was not law enforcement and not a family member, but someone connected distantly to the original dealership family, someone who had apparently been trying, on and off, for years to track her down, not entirely clear whether for money she believed she still owed, or information she believed she still had, or simply out of a long, unresolved grudge. Renata was careful to tell me that she couldn't determine with any certainty whether this man posed an actual physical danger or was simply a persistent, aggrieved nuisance. The distinction mattered enormously to what I did next, and I genuinely didn't have a clean answer. I sat with this information for almost 2 more months before I did anything about it, largely because I didn't know what the right action was. Reporting her to the police felt, in one light, like the obviously correct civic response to someone living under a false identity, possibly connected to unresolved fraud. But in another light, it felt like handing a frightened woman over to people who might have been genuinely dangerous to her over a crime that, as I could tell, she had witnessed rather than committed, and fled rather than profited meaningfully from. What finally moved me to act wasn't fear for myself. It was a small moment, almost domestic in its ordinariness. Emily, or Melissa, asked me one afternoon in her yard, in a completely unguarded, uncalculated tone, whether I thought it was possible to ever really start over, to become a genuinely different, better version of yourself, or whether the past always eventually found you no matter how far you ran. I told her I thought it was possible, though I remember my voice sounding strange to my own ears as I said it. She smiled, a small, sad smile, and said, "I hope you're right," and went back inside. I decided after that conversation that I wasn't going to report her to the police, at least not directly, not as an anonymous tip designed to blow up her life without warning. Instead, I did something that still feels, even now, like the strangest decision I've ever made. I told her what I knew. I went over one evening, sat with her at her kitchen table, and told her everything: the phone call I'd overheard, the mismatched mail, what I'd found online, and what Renata had uncovered. I watched her face go through something like 5 different emotions in the span of about 30 seconds. Fear, then something like resignation, then a strange, exhausted relief, as though a weight she'd been carrying alone for 14 years had finally, if uncomfortably, been set down in front of another human being. She told me her side of it, more detail than Renata's investigation had been able to surface. She confirmed the fraud, confirmed her fear of the family, confirmed that she had never taken anywhere near as much money as they had apparently told people she had, that the number had grown with each retelling until it had become in local legend a small fortune rather than the few $1,000s she said she had actually left with. She told me about the exhausting mechanics of building and rebuilding an identity every few years, the constant low hum of anxiety that never fully switched off, the particular loneliness of being unable to ever tell anyone, even a close friend, the actual truth of who you were. I asked her directly whether the man on the porch was actually dangerous. She said she genuinely didn't know anymore, that the fear had calcified into something closer to a permanent condition than a specific evaluable risk, which I understood, even if it wasn't a satisfying answer. I didn't report her. I want to be honest that I've turned that decision over many times since, wondering if it was moral cowardice dressed up as compassion or genuine mercy correctly applied to a complicated situation that didn't deserve a simple legal hammer. What I did instead was help her quietly, connect with an attorney Renata knew who specialized in exactly this kind of situation, people who'd fled entanglement in someone else's fraud and needed to find a legitimate, permanent way to resolve their legal exposure, rather than running indefinitely. I don't know all the details of what happened after that, because she moved away about 4 months later, this time, as far as I know, for the last time, having actually resolved something rather than simply outrunning it again. She sent me one letter after she left, no return address, thanking me for the plant conversation reversed in a way, thanking me for treating her like a person worth understanding, rather than a problem to be reported. She signed it with a name I didn't recognize, presumably her newest one, or perhaps, finally, her real one reclaimed. I've never heard from her since. I think about her more than I expected to, given how the whole thing ended. I think about how easy it would have been for me to have made a different choice at any of a dozen points along the way, to call the police the moment I found that first newspaper article, to mind my own business entirely and never look past that open mailbox in the first place. I don't know even now if what I did was right in some objective sense. I know that it felt at the time and since like the most human response available to a genuinely complicated situation, one where the tidy legal answer and the humane answer weren't quite the same thing, and I had to choose. I still live in that house. Someone else lives next door now, a retired couple, entirely unremarkable, and I like them fine. But some nights when I'm out in my own backyard, I think about a woman who spent 14 years becoming someone else, over and over, just to stay one step ahead of a mistake that was never really hers to begin with, and I hope, wherever she is now, under whatever name she's finally settled into, that she's stopped running.